The dense forest stretched endlessly, its canopy intertwining like a living fortress that filtered the pale light of a distant sun. The air was thick with the earthy scent of moss and damp soil, interrupted only by faint chirps from unseen creatures. Kian moved cautiously through the undergrowth, his boots barely making a sound. This planet, far from human colonies, demanded vigilance for survival, a constant balance of stealth and sharp instincts. What was meant to be another scavenging run quickly took an unexpected turn. Among the remnants of a brutal skirmish, scorched metal, shattered weapons, and strange alien debris, a faint groan drew his attention. Kian froze, gripping his rifle tightly as his ears homed in on the sound. He moved toward it, parting thick vines to uncover the source. Lying amidst the wreckage of a downed alien craft was a warrior, a woman. Her imposing figure, clad in dented and scorched armor, bore the insignias of rank and valor. Her powerful frame was slumped, her deep violet skin glistening with sweat and streaked with dark, viscous blood. Golden eyes flicked open as Kian stepped closer, locking onto him with a feral intensity. Her hand twitched toward a broken weapon at her side, but she lacked the strength to lift it. "Why do you hesitate?" she rasped, her voice hoarse yet commanding. "You're injured," Kian replied, his tone measured. "I'm not here to fight." She narrowed her eyes, but didn't respond. Against his better judgment, he knelt beside her, examining the wound on her side. The injury was severe, the strange hue of her blood pooling beneath her. Quickly, he tore strips from his pack to bandage her as best he could. She winced, but did not cry out. "You're a fool to help me," she muttered. "Maybe," Kian said, carefully lifting her, "but I don't leave people to die." The warrior did not resist as he carried her through the dense forest. Her piercing gaze never left him, but she remained silent. Their journey back to his hidden shelter, a cave concealed by vines and jagged rock, was slow but steady. Inside, Kian set her down on a makeshift cot and immediately began preparing supplies to tend to her wounds. Over the following days, the warrior healed under his care. She was guarded, speaking rarely, her pride and suspicion evident in every glance. Yet an unspoken understanding began to grow between them. One evening, as Kian stirred the fire, she broke the silence. "You risk much aiding me. Your kind would call you a traitor for this." "I'm not concerned with their opinions," he replied without looking up. "Out here I follow my own rules." She studied him intently, her gaze unwavering. "You have earned my respect, human." Her recovery was faster than Kian anticipated, her alien physiology aiding in her swift return to strength. Soon, she was moving about the shelter, assisting with repairs and gathering supplies. Her warrior discipline was evident in every action, and Kian found himself oddly comforted by her presence. One day, as they returned from a hunting trip, she stopped abruptly. "Your life is no longer your own," she said solemnly. Kian raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "You saved me," she continued. "Among my people, such a debt is repaid with loyalty. I will stay by your side, as protector and ally." He hesitated, unsure how to respond. "You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything," she said firmly. "And I do not abandon my oaths." Their dynamic shifted as she fulfilled her promise. She shadowed Kian during every task, her presence a silent reassurance. Her skill in combat far surpassed his own, and while he had managed on his own before, her protection gave him a newfound confidence. As the weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. They shared fragments of their pasts, her stories of a homeworld dominated by honor-bound clans and unyielding discipline, and his tales of loss and solitude in the wake of Earth's conflicts. But their fragile peace shattered one morning when the distant hum of engines broke the forest's quiet. Kian barely had time to issue a warning before human soldiers emerged, their weapons trained on the pair. The leader, a grizzled man with a cold glare, pointed his weapon at the warrior. "Step away from her," he commanded. "She's a threat." Kian stepped between them, raising his hands. "She's not your enemy," the soldier sneered. "She's an alien warrior. Her kind brought destruction to our colonies." Stand aside. The warrior spoke then, her voice calm but resolute. I'm no longer bound to my people. My loyalty lies here. The tension was palpable as the soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Kian's voice cut through the silence. If you want her, you'll have to go through me. The leader hesitated before finally lowering his weapon. You've made your choice, he said darkly. But know this. Aiding her makes you an enemy. We'll be watching. The soldiers retreated, their warning echoing in the air. The warrior turned to Kian, her expression unreadable. You would stand against your own kind for me? They're not my kind anymore, Kian replied quietly. Out here, it's just us. She nodded, golden eyes reflecting the firelight. Then we face whatever comes together. In the days that followed, they fortified their shelter and prepared for the inevitable. Yet even as danger loomed, they found solace in each other. Their bond, forged in trust and survival, was unshakable. As the chill of the new season crept into the air, they stood side by side, a testament to the resilience of honor, trust, and an unexpected partnership. Together, they were stronger than either could have been alone, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The forest stillness was deceptive. The dense canopy swayed gently with the breeze, masking the faint hum of distant engines. Kian stood at the mouth of the shelter, his rifle resting in his hands, eyes scanning the treeline. Beside him, the warrior, whom he had come to know as Leora, stood in stoic silence, her towering frame emanating readiness. Her armor, though still scarred from battle, gleamed faintly in the pale light. They'll come at night, she said, her voice low. Kian glanced at her. You're certain? She nodded. Your kind prefers to strike under the cover of darkness. It's strategic. Predictable. He smirked faintly. My kind? Her golden eyes flicked to him, a small glint of humor breaking through her stern demeanor. Present company excluded. They had spent the last week fortifying the shelter. Metal plates reinforced the cave's entrance, and an array of traps, salvaged from the wreckage of countless battles, lined the perimeter. The area was a maze of pitfalls, tripwires, and concealed explosives, each carefully placed by Leora's expert hands. Inside, they had stockpiled weapons, ammunition, and rations. Leora had insisted on teaching Kian how to wield a plasma spear she had salvaged, its alien design far deadlier than any human-made blade. He had protested at first, but her persistence wore him down. Now he could wield it with a semblance of competence. Not that he'd ever match her precision. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and violet, the pair moved back into the shelter. The fire inside was small, its light carefully shielded to avoid detection. They'll test us first, Leora said, leaning against the wall, her arms crossed. Send a scouting party to find our weaknesses. When that fails, they'll attack in force. Kian nodded. And we hold them off. For as long as we can. The weight of her words hung in the air. Leora had no illusions about their chances against a fully equipped human strike team. Kian didn't either, but he wasn't about to voice that doubt. Instead, he tightened the strap on his rifle and focused on the moment. The attack came just as Leora predicted, under cover of darkness. Kian was awakened by the faintest crunch of leaves outside the cave. He sat up instantly, rifle in hand, as Leora moved silently to the entrance. Her keen senses detected what Kian's human ears could not. Scouts, she whispered, her hand brushing the hilt of her plasma blade. 4 of them, lightly armed. Kian positioned himself near a narrow opening in the rock wall, his rifle aimed at the forest. Through the faint moonlight, he spotted movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. Leora motioned for him to hold fire. Wait, she murmured. The first scout stepped into one of her traps, a concealed net that snapped upward, suspending the soldier high in the air. He barely had time to shout before the second trap triggered, a flurry of darts launching from hidden tubes and striking another scout in the leg. The man fell with a muffled cry, his weapon clattering to the ground. 2 left. The remaining scouts hesitated, clearly aware they were walking into a trap. Kian shifted his aim, lining up his shot. A sharp whistle cut through the air, a signal. Moments later, a burst of plasma fire erupted from the tree-line, forcing Kian and Leora to duck behind the reinforced walls of the shelter. "They're calling for reinforcements," Kian said, his voice tight. Leora's eyes gleamed with fierce determination. "Good. Let them come." The forest exploded with activity. Soldiers emerged in coordinated waves, their weapons trained on the shelter. The trap slowed them down. Some were caught in pits, others triggered explosives, but the attackers adapted quickly. Kian fired from his position, taking down 2 soldiers who got too close. Beside him, Leora moved like a force of nature. She leaped from the shelter's entrance, her plasma blade cutting through the air with a searing hum. The first soldier she encountered fell instantly, his armor no match for her strength. A second soldier lunged at her, but she sidestepped with inhuman speed, disarming him with a sharp twist of her arm. She finished him with a strike so swift it left no time for retaliation. "Kian," she called, her voice cutting through the chaos. He turned just in time to see a soldier flanking their position. Leora's warning gave him the second he needed to fire, the shot striking true. The soldier crumpled to the ground. For a moment, the battle lulled. Smoke and the faint smell of scorched earth filled the air. Leora returned to the shelter, her armor stained with blood, both human and her own. "Reinforcements will be here soon," she said, her breathing steady despite the intensity of the fight. "We can't hold this position forever." Kian nodded grimly. "Then what's the plan?" She hesitated, as though weighing her next words carefully. "We run, deeper into the wilderness. They won't expect us to abandon the shelter. And if they do, then we fight." Kian didn't argue. He grabbed a pack filled with essentials, ammo, food, and medical supplies, while Leora readied her weapons. They moved quickly, slipping into the forest shadows just as the distant sound of engines grew louder. The wilderness was a maze of towering trees and dense foliage. Leora led the way, her movements fluid and purposeful. Kian followed close behind, trusting her instincts. "They won't stop," he said after a while, his voice low. "No," she agreed, "but they'll tire. Your kind isn't built for endurance." He almost laughed, despite the gravity of the situation. "You've always got a jab ready, don't you?" Leora glanced back, the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. "Humor keeps you alive, human. Don't lose it." They pressed on, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter. The night stretched on, the moon their only guide. As exhaustion began to creep in, they found temporary refuge in the hollow of a massive tree. As Kian slumped against the rough bark, Leora sat beside him, her golden eyes scanning the darkness. "They'll find us again," he said. "Yes," she replied simply. "But we'll face them together," he added. She turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "Always." The silence that followed was heavy but not oppressive. In it lay an unspoken resolve, a bond forged in blood and trust. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The morning broke with a muted glow, the forest canopy blocking all but the faintest traces of sunlight. Kian stirred first, the ache in his body a reminder of the relentless pursuit from the night before. Leora sat nearby, her posture rigid, her golden eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "They're moving slower," she said, her voice low. "The traps and the terrain have forced them to spread out. We have time to regroup." Kian nodded, brushing leaves from his hair. "How long before they catch up?" "A day, maybe less," Leora replied. "Unless we find a way to misdirect them." Kian sighed, the weight of their predicament settling heavily on his shoulders. "We can't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they'll pin us down." Leora tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "There may be another option, one that requires trust." Kian raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." As they trekked deeper into the wilderness, Leora explained her plan. "There's a faction of my people on this planet," she began, her voice measured. "A small group of exiles, warriors who rebelled against the High Command. They operate in secrecy, hidden from both their kind and yours." "Rebels?" Kian frowned. "And you think they'll help us?" "They might," she said, They value survival above loyalty to the old ways. If we can convince them that we share a common enemy, they could offer us sanctuary, or at the very least a chance to fight back. Kian was silent for a moment, considering the risks. And if they see me as an enemy? Leora's jaw tightened. They will listen to me. Among my people, a life dead is sacred. They will honor my word, or face my blade. Kian exhaled sharply, a mix of apprehension and hope stirring within him. All right, lead the way. The journey to the rebels' hideout was grueling. The forest grew denser, the air thicker with humidity. Leora moved with practiced ease, her movements precise and deliberate, while Kian struggled to keep pace. As they approached a rocky ravine, Leora halted abruptly, her hand raised in a silent signal. Kian froze, his rifle at the ready. "What is it?" he whispered. "Watchers," she said, pointing to the treetops. Kian squinted, barely making out the faint shimmer of cloaked figures perched in the branches. Their silhouettes were faint, blending seamlessly with the foliage, but the glint of weapons betrayed their presence. "Lower your weapon," Leora instructed softly. Kian hesitated but complied, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Leora stepped forward, her voice ringing out in her native tongue, a series of guttural syllables that sounded like a mix of command and entreaty. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, one by one, the Watchers revealed themselves, their cloaking devices deactivating. They were tall, like Leora, their armor bearing similar markings of rank and honor. Their eyes, golden, like hers, were sharp and calculating. One of them descended gracefully from the trees, their plasma spear held loosely but ready. Their gaze swept over Kian, then returned to Leora. "Leora Virek," the warriors said in their language. "You are far from the battlefield." "So are you, Kethra," Leora replied, her tone steady. Kethra's gaze flicked back to Kian, her expression hardening. "And you bring a human. Why?" "He saved my life," Leora said simply. "I owe him my allegiance. And now he seeks your help." Kethra's eyes narrowed. "Why should we trust him? His kind hunts us like animals." "Because he is hunted as well," Leora countered. "By his own people. They see him as a traitor for aiding me." Kethra regarded Kian for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped closer, towering over him. "Human," she said, her voice sharp and accented. "What do you want from us?" Kian met her gaze, refusing to flinch. "A chance to fight back. They won't stop coming for us. We need allies, and Leora said you might help." Kethra's lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. "Bold. But boldness does not guarantee survival." "No," Kian agreed. "But it's a start." The rebels led them to their hideout, a sprawling network of caves hidden deep within the ravine. The space was illuminated by bioluminescent plants and glowing crystals embedded in the walls. Alien machinery hummed softly in the background, evidence of scavenged technology repurposed for survival. Kian noticed the wary glances from the other rebels as they passed. Some muttered in their native tongue, their expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Inside the central chamber, Kethra addressed the group. She spoke quickly, her words sharp and decisive. Kian couldn't understand the language, but Leora stood by his side, her posture unwavering. When Kethra finished, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to Kian. "They're deciding whether to kill me, aren't they?" he muttered. Leora's lips twitched in the faintest hint of amusement. "Not yet." Finally, Kethra stepped forward again. "You wish to fight the humans who hunt you?" Kian nodded. "Then prove your worth," she said. "There is a human outpost nearby, heavily armed but poorly defended. We have been watching them for weeks, planning our attack. If you and Leora can eliminate their communications array, we may consider your request." "And if we fail?" Kian asked. Kethra smiled coldly. "Then we will have our answer." That night, Kian and Leora prepared for the mission. She inspected their weapons with meticulous care, ensuring every piece of gear was in perfect condition. "You don't have to do this," Kian said, watching her work. "Yes, I do," she replied without looking up. "Your survival is my responsibility." Kian frowned. That doesn't mean you have to throw yourself into danger for me. Leora finally met his gaze, her golden eyes fierce. Among my people, trust is earned through action. Words mean little. If I ask them to trust you, I must show them that you are worth the risk. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. You know, sometimes I forget how stubborn you are. Her lips quirked into a small, rare smile. It is one of my better traits. As they slipped into the night, leaving the safety of the rebel hideout behind, Kian couldn't help but feel the weight of the task ahead. The outpost was just the beginning. If they failed, it would mean death. But if they succeeded, it might just be the first step toward turning the tide. And for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone. The cool night air was thick with tension as Kian and Leora approached the outskirts of the human outpost. The faint hum of the outpost's generators buzzed in the distance, mingling with the chirps and rustles of nocturnal wildlife. Kian adjusted the straps of his pack, his pulse quickening. Leora crouched low beside him, her alien frame blending seamlessly with the shadows. She pointed toward the outpost perimeter. There, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The communications array is at the center. If we disable it, they'll be blind to incoming reinforcements. Kian nodded, his gaze scanning the patrol routes of the soldiers guarding the installation. They moved in pairs, their paths predictable. The outpost was built hastily, with basic fortifications, a sign that they didn't expect much resistance. Minimal guards, he murmured. Either they're overconfident, or they think they're too far out to be noticed. Or both, Leora replied. Her eyes glinted in the dim light, the sharpness of her focus unwavering. We moved quickly and silently. No mistakes. The two crept closer, using the undergrowth and scattered debris as cover. Kian gripped his rifle tightly, every step deliberate and soundless. His breaths came shallow, his ears tuned to every faint noise. When they reached the outer fence, Leora pulled a small device from her belt. It emitted a faint, pulsing light as she pressed it against the barrier. With a soft hiss, the electrical charge powering the fence flickered and died. Go, she mouthed. They slipped through the opening, hugging the shadows as they navigated the maze of prefab buildings and supply crates. The soldiers patrolled methodically, their chatter muted by the weight of their surroundings. Leora raised her hand, signaling for Kian to stop. Ahead, two guards stood near a stack of crates, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders. Leora motioned for Kian to stay back, then moved with liquid grace. Before the guards could react, she was upon them. A flash of metal and a whispered grunt were the only sounds as they crumpled silently to the ground. Kian approached cautiously, his gaze flicking between Leora and the fallen soldiers. Efficient, he muttered. She wiped her blade clean, her expression unreadable. Keep moving. As they neared the center of the outpost, the hum of the communications array grew louder. The structure loomed above them, a towering beacon of human ingenuity and arrogance. There's a control panel on the east side, Leora said. It will allow me to disable the system. Cover me? Kian nodded, positioning himself behind a stack of barrels that offered a clear view of the area. His rifle was steady in his hands, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Leora moved swiftly, her movements silent and precise. She reached the panel and began working, her fingers flying over the controls. Kian's eyes darted between her and the perimeter. The soldiers were still unaware of their presence, but that could change at any moment. A faint click echoed from the array, followed by a low whine as the system powered down. Leora stepped back, her expression triumphant. It's done, she whispered. Before Kian could respond, a sharp voice rang out. Hey, stop right there. Kian spun, his rifle snapping to his shoulder. A soldier stood a few yards away, his weapon trained on Leora. Without hesitation, Kian fired. The shot was clean and precise, the soldier dropping instantly. The sound of the gunfire shattered the silence. Alarms blared as lights flooded the outpost, illuminating every shadowed corner. Run! Leora barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. They sprinted toward the fence, their path lit by the muzzle flashes of incoming fire. Kian returned shots as they moved, his aim steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Leora moved like a force of nature, her blade flashing as she cut down anyone who got too close. Her speed and precision were unmatched, a blur of motion that left a trail of destruction in her wake. By the time they reached the fence, the entire outpost was in disarray. Soldiers shouted orders, their voices drowned out by the blaring alarms. Leora activated the device again, disabling the fence just long enough for them to slip through. As they disappeared into the forest, the outpost receded into the distance, its lights flickering like a wounded beast. They didn't stop running until they were deep within the safety of the trees. Finally, Kian collapsed against a fallen log, his chest heaving. That could have gone smoother, he panted. Leora knelt beside him, her breathing steady despite the exertion. We achieved our goal. Their communications are down. That's all that matters. Kian shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. You really don't do gratitude, do you? She tilted her head, her golden eyes studying him. Gratitude is unnecessary when survival is the priority. But she hesitated, then added, your skill in combat is improving. Kian chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. When they returned to the rebel hideout, Kethra and her warriors were waiting. You succeeded, Kethra said, her tone laced with grudging respect. The outpost is in chaos. Their reinforcements will be delayed, if not entirely cut off. Leora inclined her head. We did as you asked. Will you honor your word? Kethra was silent for a moment, then nodded. You have earned a place among us for now, but understand this, trust is fragile. If either of you gives us reason to doubt, there will be no second chances. Kian met her gaze, his expression resolute. Understood. That night, as they sat around a small fire within the rebel camp, Kian turned to Leora. Do you think they'll ever fully trust us? He asked. Leora's gaze flicked to the flames, her expression contemplative. Trust is not given lightly among my people. It must be earned, over time and through action. Kian nodded slowly. Then I guess we keep proving ourselves. She looked at him, her golden eyes softening. We will. For the first time since their journey began, Kian felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they had survived the impossible. Now, they had allies, however tenuous. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, they had a fighting chance.